The crock was the same temperature as the room, and that was the problem. Miriam Troyer set her hand against the outside of it, the stoneware cool and dense under her palm, and she held it there the way you hold your hand over a stove burner before you decide whether to touch it, except in reverse. She was checking for what wasn't there. The crock had sat on that counter for 22 years, and in all that time, it had never been room temperature, because in all that time, there had always been something alive inside it, working and producing heat. And now the room was 45 degrees and the crock was 45 degrees, and those two things being equal meant something had stopped. She reached for the cloth to cover it before throwing it out. That was the order she planned. Cover it, carry it to the compost, done. 22 years was a long time. She was not going to pretend otherwise. Then she saw the foam, not the full dome of a fed and working culture, not the robust, yeasty crown that should have been climbing the inside of the crock by that hour of morning. A crescent, a thin arc of bubbles along one side, at the 2 o'clock position if the crock were a clock face, each bubble the size of a pin, and the cluster no wider than her thumbnail, working its way, or trying to, up the inside of the stoneware. Miriam set the cloth down. She stood in the kitchen in her coat, because the wood stove had only been running for 2 hours and the room was still 45 degrees, and she looked at the bubble cluster, and she did not move for what was probably a full minute. Then she went to the flour bin. Before we go any further, you should know one thing about Miriam Troyer that will explain most of what follows. She was not, by any account of anyone in District 14 who had known her for the 30 years she had lived in the settlement, a dramatic woman. She did not make speeches. She did not require an audience for her decisions. When her husband Eli died of a cardiac event in the field behind the barn, 18 months before this January morning, she had sat with him until the ambulance came, and then she had gone inside and called her oldest daughter from the phone shanty at the road. And then she had come back in and made supper, because there were animals to feed in the morning, and she needed to be capable of feeding them. The bishop came. The deacons came. The women of the district brought food for 2 weeks. She thanked each of them, and she kept the food that would keep and composted the rest after a week, because her refrigerator was getting full. She was not cold. She was just not dramatic. The difference matters, and it matters here, because what she did next with that crock was not an act of grief or stubbornness or anything a person would make a speech about. It was an act of checking. She was not ready to conclude something was finished until she had checked. She had been 22 years old when she got the starter. That was the summer she returned from Millersburg and joined the church. The summer she married Eli Troyer in a ceremony in his parents' barn that she mostly remembered as one long, sustained noise of people and benches and food. The 2 years before that, from 18 to 20, she had spent in what her district referred to simply as her time away, working as a kitchen helper at a small inn outside Millersburg, run by a Mennonite family named Graber. Ruth Graber was the cook, a woman then in her middle 50s who moved through a kitchen the way water moves downhill, without apparent thought and without waste. Miriam had gone there expecting to learn how to be useful, which she already was. She had not expected to learn to bake bread, not really bake it, not at the level Ruth Graber baked it, which was the level of someone who understood that bread was a managed biological process and not a recipe. Ruth kept a sourdough starter and a stoneware crock on the counter by the window. She fed it every day without exception, even on Sundays, even when the inn was closed, because you could not explain to a culture of living organisms that it was a rest day. She talked about its behavior in the same plain language she used for everything else. "It doubles in 5 hours when it's happy," she told Miriam once. "It doubles in 7 when something is off. It smells like vinegar when it's too cold or you've missed a feed. It smells like bread when it's right. Listen to it. That is not a metaphor. Put your nose over the crock in the morning before you do anything else, and it will tell you what it needs. When Miriam left to marry Eli and join the church, Ruth Graber gave her a quarter cup of that starter in a small jar with a cloth rubber banded over the top. She wrote the feed ratio on a piece of paper in pencil. Equal weights flour and water every 24 hours, or every 12 in summer. Discard half before each feed, or it'll outgrow the crock. Never use chlorinated water straight from the tap. Let it sit out until it's room temperature before you use it. She said, "You'll have this longer than most things." Miriam had kept it for 22 years. She had fed it through 5 births, through 2 bad winters. Through the year, the flour prices doubled, and she had to switch brands, and the culture took 3 weeks to adjust. She had fed it when Eli was sick and when Eli died, and on the ordinary days between, which were most of the days. The starter was not sentimental to her. It was a tool, and it was alive, and she maintained it the way you maintain any living tool. The blizzard had come in on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January. The forecast had been for 8 to 12 inches. It delivered 22, measured by Miriam at the fence post on Friday morning when she went out to check the coop. A mark at the 1-foot post notch, and then another 2 inches above it. Wind chill at -18. The snow was still coming. Her heat situation was complicated. The farmhouse had a wood stove in the sitting room and a propane range and oven in the kitchen, standard for her district, where old order families use propane cooking equipment but not grid electricity. The sitting room stove had a cracked firebox that Eli had intended to repair the previous autumn and had not repaired before he died, and that Miriam had not repaired since, because the propane range gave off enough ambient heat to keep the kitchen passable in early winter, and she had been getting by. She had a good supply of firewood stacked on the porch, cut in October. What she had not replenished before the storm was the propane tank, which she had meant to call about from the phone shanty the week before, and hadn't done before the weather turned. The propane ran out at 2 in the morning on Saturday. She woke to the silence of it, the burner clicking off, the house beginning its long exhale of stored warmth into the cold. She got up and put on her coat and her boots over her nightclothes and went to the sitting room and looked at the wood stove and its cracked firebox and made a decision. She went to the barn lean-to and broke apart 3 sections of an old corn crib wall, carried the lumber in 2 armloads, and got the stove running. The firebox held. By 5 in the morning, the kitchen was back to 48 degrees. By 7, it was 52. But the coop was attached to the barn and not to the house, and the barn ran on stored body heat from the 2 pigs and the draft horse and the 12 Plymouth barred rock hens, and that was normally enough. But in 22 inches of snow at -18 degrees Fahrenheit, it was not enough for the hens, which needed a minimum of around 40 degrees to survive, and whose body heat alone could not hold that temperature in an uninsulated structure in those conditions. She did not know this was happening while it was happening. She found out Monday morning when she went out to feed them. 10 of the 12 were dead. She stood in the coop door in the gray morning light and counted them, and then she counted again because that was the right thing to do before concluding, and the number was 10 both times. The 2 survivors were in the far corner on the roost bar, compressed together into one dense shape, alive. She could see their breath. She brought both of them into the kitchen that morning and put them in a cardboard box near the stove, and she did not name them or talk to them or treat them as anything other than 2 animals that had survived when 10 had not, and that would need feed and water until she could sort out the coop situation. The kitchen on that Sunday morning, before she went out to deal with the hens, was where she had stood with her hand on the crock. She took a tablespoon of culture from the center of the crock, not from the top, which had been most exposed to the cold air, and not from the edges, which were always more vulnerable, but from the center, which was where, in a healthy working culture, the most protected organisms would be. She put the tablespoon into a clean jar. She added 15 grams of flour and 15 grams of water that she had let sit since the night before to reach room temperature, because the tap ran cold in January and cold water would not help. She stirred it. She covered the jar with a cloth. She put the jar 18 inches from the stove, on the end of the counter where the ambient temperature was around 68 degrees, and she left it. She did not feel hopeful or hopeless. She felt like a person who had started a thing and would now wait and see what the thing did. Amos Hirschberger came by on Monday morning to help her move the hens. He was 67 years old and had been her nearest neighbor for the full 30 years she had lived in the settlement, a widower now himself for the past 8. And he was a decent man with a habit of knowing things just slightly less completely than he believed he knew them. He helped her carry the 10 frozen birds out of the coop, and he was kind about it in his wordless way. And when he left, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the counter and said, "You lose the bread crocks too." He had seen the starter crock sitting out earlier, she supposed, and drawn a conclusion. "I didn't throw out the crocks," Miriam said. Amos nodded slowly in the way that meant he heard her but was not fully revising his picture. He left. She went back to the jar on the counter. By Tuesday it smelled wrong. She put her nose over the cloth in the morning, the way Ruth Graber had taught her, and the smell was sharp and vinegar-forward and thin, which meant the cold had stressed the culture toward lactic acid production and away from the yeast activity she needed. This was not a death sentence. It was information. A cold stress starter shifts its microbial balance. The lactic acid bacteria, which can tolerate lower temperatures better than the wild yeast, had survived better and were dominating. The yeast would come back if conditions improved, but she needed to help them. She began feeding twice a day instead of once, 12 hours apart, with a slightly higher flour ratio, 2 parts flour to 1 part water instead of equal parts, giving the yeast more food. She discarded half before each feed without sentiment. The discard went to the compost. She did not check on the jar more than twice a day. Watching more often than that accomplished nothing, and she knew it. Sadie Yoder came by on Wednesday to bring a loaf of her own bread and to ask how Miriam was getting on, which was the right thing to do and which Miriam appreciated without particularly needing. Sadie was the bishop's wife, 52 years old, a woman who genuinely meant well and who processed the world by talking about it with others, which was a human characteristic and not a fault. She came into the kitchen and sat at the table, and they had coffee, and Miriam told her plainly what had happened: the propane, the stove, the hens, the temperature. She did not mention the starter. Sadie asked if she needed anything, and Miriam said she needed a firebox repair, or a new firebox plate, cast iron, and a call made from the phone shanty to the propane supplier. Sadie said she would have Levi speak to Amos about the firebox. Miriam said that was fine. When Sadie left, she saw the jar on the counter and asked what it was. Miriam said it was the starter. She was bringing it back. Sadie looked at the jar, which contained at that moment a small quantity of beige paste that did not look like much of anything. She said, "Well, we'll see." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way you say it when you think something is probably not going to work out, but you don't want to be the one to say so directly. Miriam said, "Yes," and walked her to the door. By the end of the first week, the tablespoon of culture had been fed out to 4 ounces. The smell was improving. Less vinegar, more of the yeasty, mildly sour smell that meant the right organisms were gaining ground. She did a float test on a small amount, dropping a half teaspoon into a glass of water. It sank. That meant the yeast activity was not yet high enough to produce the gas bubbles that would make it float. Not ready. She noted this in her baking log in plain language, the same log she had kept for 11 years in a series of composition notebooks in the kitchen drawer. Date, weight of culture, smell, float test result, rise measurement, if any, ambient temperature, hours since last feed. She had 3 notebooks already filled. She started the 4th on the Monday after the blizzard. Rise at day 7, 30% above the starting mark over 8 hours. Healthy was a doubling, 100%, in 4 to 6 hours. 30% was not healthy. It was movement, which was not nothing. She adjusted the flour ratio again and continued. The firebox plate arrived from the Millersburg Farm Supply on the following Thursday. Cast iron, the right dimensions, brought out by Amos in his buggy along with the confirmation that the propane supplier would come on Friday. She thanked him. He came in to look at the stove and see about the fitting, and while he was in the kitchen, he saw the jar had been replaced by a larger jar, half-pint size, and there was a small mark in pencil on the side of the jar, with a rubber band below it to track the rise. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and she could see him recalibrating again. Not all the way, but some. Still working on that, he said. Still working on it, she said. He fit the firebox plate. It was not a perfect fit, but it was close enough to hold and she would manage. He left and she went back to her log. Sadie Yoder, at the quilting frolic at the Kaufman farm the following Thursday, told the assembled women what she knew, which was that Miriam had lost most of her hens in the storm, and that she had some project going with her sourdough that wasn't quite working out yet. She said it with the careful gentleness of someone reporting a situation that is probably not going to resolve well, so that everyone can be prepared to be sympathetic in the right way at the right time. The women received this information in the way of women who have seen things not work out before, and who understand that sympathy delivered accurately and at the right time is a useful thing. Harold Schwarzentruber heard something of the same from his wife, who had heard it from a woman at the dry goods store. He was 38 years old and operated a Mennonite produce stand at the edge of the settlement, where he sold vegetables and eggs and canned goods from several local farms, including Miriam's. He had been buying her eggs for 4 years and her bread, when she had extra, for 2. He drove out to the farm on a Friday in the second week of February, partly to check whether she had eggs yet, which she probably did not, and partly because he was a methodical man himself, and he wanted to see how things stood. He sat at the kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him and he asked directly how the hens were doing. She told him. 2 survivors from the original 12. 6 new pullets coming from Reuben Kaufman's farm in March, once they were old enough to move. In the meantime, 2 eggs a day. He nodded. He asked about the bread. I have a test loaf, she said. If you want it. He said he would take a look. She brought it out from the cloth it had been resting in. It was a sourdough boule, round, scored on top in the crosshatch she always used. It had risen in the proofing basket for 4 hours, and then gone into the propane oven at 450 for the first 20 minutes with a pan of water for steam, then down to 425 until the internal temperature reached 205. The crust was the right color. She turned it over and knocked on the bottom with her knuckle. The sound came back, hollow enough. She set it right side up. The crumb, when she cut it, was denser than it should have been. The holes were small and irregular rather than the open, uneven crumb structure of a fully active culture. The culture was at 75% of the rise it should have had in the proofing window, not the full doubling she needed. The bread was edible. It was not what she could sell at the price she charged and call it right. She cut 2 slices and put them in front of Harold and took one herself. He ate both slices without saying anything, which was how Harold ate things he was evaluating. Then he said, "Dense." "Yes," she said, "but the flavor's there." "The flavor was always going to be there," she said. "The structure isn't right yet." She told him plainly what the rise numbers were, what she was adjusting, what she expected the timeline to be. He listened the way a man listens when he is deciding whether to believe something. "How many of these can you do in a week?" he said, "when it's right?" She thought about it. 12, she said, to start. He looked at the loaf on the table. He said, "Let me know when you're at 12. He took the remaining half of the loaf when he left. She watched him go from the kitchen window, the 2 hens in their box in the corner making the small domestic sounds of animals settling. She went to her log. She wrote, "Loaf 1, crumb too tight. Rise 75%. Adjusted hydration 3%. Next feed in 12 hours. She did not write anything about how it tasted because that was not the information she needed. By day 21, she had 16 ounces of active culture and it was doubling. 110% above the rubber band mark on the jar over 5.5 hours at 68 degrees ambient, fed at a 1:1:1 ratio of starter to flour to water by weight. She had been keeping the log entry every 12 hours, and the numbers had moved in one direction, slowly, without drama, in the direction she needed. She baked on day 21. The loaf came out of the oven with a crust that sounded different when she tapped it. Not hollow enough. Fully hollow. The low knock of air behind the crust that meant the crumb had opened properly. She turned it out of the Dutch oven onto the rack, and she looked at the score marks, which had opened in the oven the way they were supposed to, spreading out and blooming at the edges in a way that only happens when the structure is there to support it. She set it on the rack and did not touch it for the full hour it needed to finish setting the crumb. She had learned this from Ruth Graber also. Cutting too early was the last way to ruin a good loaf, and there was no fixing it once it was done. When she cut it, the crumb was open and irregular, the holes various sizes distributed through the slice, the way a properly fermented, long-proofed sourdough should look. She ate 1 slice with butter and no other additions, because that was the test. The sourness was present but not sharp. The wheat flavor was forward. It tasted like her bread, the bread she'd been making for 22 years from this culture, from this same wild yeast and this same colony of bacteria that had survived 9 hours at 37 degrees in a stoneware crock in an unheated farmhouse, while a blizzard delivered 22 inches of snow outside. She did not say anything to the room. She wrapped the loaf in cloth and started a second. By the 6th week from the blizzard Sunday, she was producing 12 loaves a week and had 2 standing orders. Amos Hirschberger's daughter-in-law, Rebecca, who was 28 and had been buying from Miriam at the produce auction since before the blizzard, had placed an order for 2 loaves a week, delivered when Amos came by on his regular errand days. Harold Schwarzentruber had placed an order for 4 loaves a week for the produce stand, with the understanding that if they moved well, he would want more. The Charm produce auction ran a limited early season session in the first week of March, mostly for seed and preserved goods and livestock, and Miriam went on a Tuesday to arrange the pullet purchase from Reuben Kaufman, who was 51 and had a good laying flock and had agreed over the phone, through the phone shanty, to sell her 6 silver-laced Wyandottes that were 8 weeks old and would be ready to move. She was at the auction tables talking with Reuben about delivery when Amos Hirschberger appeared with 2 men she recognized by face but not by name. From one of the districts east of Charm, she heard Amos telling them about the bread, which he was doing in his way, with the confidence of someone who has watched a situation from a comfortable distance and concluded he understands it fully. 12 loaves, he was telling them, when things are going right for her. She's been working at it since the storm. The two men nodded in the way that 12 loaves means to someone who is measuring it as a business, which is to say they nodded politely and moved on from the subject. Miriam finished her conversation with Reuben. The 6 pullets would come the following Thursday. She turned and one of the two men, the taller of them, caught her eye and said, being friendly, "We hear you're doing some baking. 12 loaves this week," she said. "More next week." He nodded the same polite nod. She could see he was being kind. She did not need him to be, but she appreciated it in the same way she appreciated Sadie's visits, as a thing that was well-intentioned and therefore worth something, even when it was based on incomplete information. Reuben shook her hand, and she went to look at seed prices. Here is what was true on that day. At that auction, in the first week of March, the culture was running at full capacity. The 2 surviving hens were laying 1 egg each per day and had been since the 3rd week of February, which was earlier than she expected. The propane tank was full. The wood stove firebox was holding. Her baking log showed 16 consecutive feedings at the correct rise measurement, which was as reliable a baseline as she had had in years. She had 12 loaves going out that week, and she had already worked out in her composition notebook, in pencil, the feed schedule and flour quantities needed to reach 18 the following week and 24 the week after. The community thought she was managing. They thought she was getting by on 12 loaves when things went right for her. They were not wrong about the 12 loaves. They were wrong about where 12 loaves stood in the arc of what she was doing. But that was not something she was going to explain at the Charm Produce auction in early March to a man she did not know by name. There was no reason to explain it. The numbers would explain it in their own time, the way numbers always do, which is without commentary and without any particular interest in whether you believed them before they arrived. She drove home in the buggy with the seed prices written in her notebook and the pullet delivery confirmed for Thursday. And she went inside and fed the culture at its 12-hour mark, and she put the evening's 2 loaves into their proofing baskets and covered them with damp cloth and set them near the stove for the overnight rise. She did not feel like she had won anything. She felt like someone who had checked carefully before concluding, and had found that the conclusion everyone else had already reached was, in the specific and measurable sense, not yet correct. That was enough. That had always been enough. Ada Schlabach arrived on a Monday morning in the 2nd week of March, 2 days before the pullets came, carrying a covered dish her mother had sent and wearing the expression of someone who has been told to be helpful and is not entirely sure what that means in practice. She was 19 years old, the 2nd daughter of a farm family 2 properties east, and she had grown up watching her mother bake the ordinary way, from commercial yeast, and she knew how to follow a recipe and not much beyond that. Miriam had arranged the arrangement through Amos, who had mentioned Ada was looking for part-time work through the planting season. Miriam had thought about it for 2 days, and then sent word that she could use someone on Mondays and Thursdays to start. She put Ada to work immediately, because there was no useful way to explain bread making in the abstract. You learned it by doing it next to someone who knew, and then you did it again, and then again, until the sequence was in your hands rather than your head. This was what Ruth Graber had understood, and this was how Miriam taught. The first thing she showed Ada was the culture. She brought the crock to the table, the same stoneware crock from the counter, and she took off the cloth and told Ada to put her nose over it. Ada did cautiously. Miriam asked her what she smelled. Ada said it smelled like bread, a little sour, kind of yeasty. Miriam said, "That is what it should smell like. If it smells like vinegar, something is off. If it smells flat, something is off in a different direction. Your nose tells you before the numbers do, but then you check the numbers to find out how far off and what to do about it." She showed Ada the log, not all 11 years of it, just the current notebook, the entries since the blizzard Sunday, the penciled columns of dates and weights and rise measurements and ambient temperatures, and the two-word notes in the margin that said things like smell improved and crust right and crumb still tight and adjusted hydration. Ada looked at the columns and said, "You write all this down every day?" "Twice a day," Miriam said. Ada was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebook. Then she said, "What happened in January?" Meaning the cluster of closely spaced entries near the front of the notebook, the entries where the numbers were small and the notes were terse. Miriam told her plainly. The blizzard, the propane, the temperature drop, the single tablespoon she had pulled from the center of the crock and started building from. Ada listened without interrupting. When Miriam finished, Ada looked at the crock on the table, the full working culture now, the 16 ounces running at consistent doubling, and she said, "How did you know it would come back?" Miriam considered the question. "I didn't," she said. "I knew there was something in it that might come back. Those are different things." She showed Ada the discard and feed process. Weigh the crock with the culture, remove half by weight, add flour and water in equal weights to what remained. The discarded half went into a separate container for the discard loaves, the ones she sold at a lower price because the flavor was good, but the rise was inconsistent. Nothing was wasted. Ada watched the first time and did it herself the second time, carefully, checking the scale reading twice before she was satisfied. Miriam let her check twice. Precision was not a fault. By the third Monday, Ada's hands knew the process well enough that Miriam could start her on the shaping while she managed the oven. Shaping was the part that took longest to learn because the pressure had to be consistent and the tension had to build from the outside of the dough inward. And you could not see the tension, only feel it. And you had to learn what right felt like before you could recognize wrong. Ada overworked the first 3 loaves she shaped and underworked the next 2. By the 6th, she was finding the right pressure. Miriam didn't praise her for the 6th loaf because that was the expected outcome of 6 attempts, not an exceptional result. She said, "That one's right. Do it the same way next time." Ada did it the same way, and the time after that. It was on a Thursday in the 4th week of March during the morning bake that Ada pulled a loaf from its proofing basket and looked at it with the expression of someone calculating risk. The loaf had risen unevenly in the basket, higher on one side than the other, which sometimes meant the shaping tension was off, and sometimes just meant the basket had sat at a slight angle. She turned it in her hands and started to set it aside from the others going into the oven. Miriam was at the sink. She said, without turning around, "What are you doing with that one?" Ada said she wasn't sure about it. The rise was uneven. "Knock on it," Miriam said. Ada turned the loaf over and rapped the bottom with her knuckle. The sound came back hollow, the clean, resonant hollow of a properly structured crumb waiting to be baked. She looked at the loaf and then she looked at Miriam. "You don't throw a loaf until you've knocked on it," Miriam said. She was still at the sink, her back to Ada. "Someone told me that when I was about your age. Put it in." Ada put it in. The loaf came out of the oven 45 minutes later with a better ear on the score than most of the others in that batch, the crust opening at the cut in a clean curve that meant the structure had been fine all along. They did not discuss it further. Ada wrote the loaf's weight and bake time in the secondary log Miriam had started for her, and she moved on to the next task, and the morning continued. She had been about Miriam's age when Ruth Graber said it. Not exactly. Miriam had been 18, maybe 19, a girl still in many ways, working in a kitchen that was not her kitchen, and learning from a woman who was not her mother. She had been pulling a loaf she thought was underdone, ready to set it back for another 10 minutes, when Ruth had stopped her and told her to knock first. The loaf had been done. She had learned two things at once: how to check a loaf and the principle underneath the checking, which was that you did not reach a conclusion before you had gathered the information the conclusion required. Ruth Graber had been dead for 6 years. Miriam had gotten the news through the phone shanty, a call from a Mennonite woman she did not know who had found her name in Ruth's address book. She had sat with that for an afternoon, and then she had gone to feed the culture and bake the next day's bread, because that was what Ruth Graber would have wanted from her, not grief, but the continuation of the thing Ruth had given her. The 6 silver-laced Wyandotte pullets from Reuben Kaufman had arrived on the Thursday before Ada's third Monday and had been installed in the repaired coop alongside the 2 barred rock survivors. Wyandottes were cold, hardy birds, a practical choice for the climate, and Reuben's stock was healthy. The pullets were 8 weeks old at arrival and would not begin laying until around 18 to 20 weeks, which put first eggs in late May at the earliest. In the meantime, the 2 survivors were producing reliably, 1 egg each per day, and those 2 eggs per day were going into the enriched sandwich loaf. The enriched loaf was Miriam's own adjustment, not from Ruth's teaching. She had developed it 3 years earlier as a way to use the excess eggs in spring when the flock was producing more than she could sell outright. Egg yolk in the dough added fat, which softened the crumb and extended the shelf life, and made the bread behave differently in a toaster, more evenly, less likely to burn at the edges. She used 1 yolk per loaf incorporated during the initial mix, and the resulting crumb was tighter than the boule, but uniformly tender in a way people who were not bread people tended to prefer. She had started making 2 of the 12 weekly loaves as enriched sandwich loaves in the 3rd week, when the barred rock survivors had established their laying rhythm. By the 5th week, she was making 4. Harold Schwartzentruber had noticed without being told. He came for his weekly pickup on a Friday, and she gave him 2 boules and 2 sandwich loaves, and he looked at the sandwich loaves and said, "These are different." "Egg yolk," she said. 2 eggs a day from the survivors. It's in the sandwich loaves. He took them. He called from the phone shanty on Monday to say the sandwich loaves had sold in 1 morning, and could she do 4 of those going forward instead of 2? She said she could do 4. She wrote it in the log. By the 8th week from the blizzard Sunday, 6 weeks into Ada's involvement, production was at 40 loaves per week. The breakdown was 24 plain sourdough boules and 16 enriched sandwich loaves. Ada was managing Monday and Thursday bakes independently, with Miriam present but not directing. The log entries in Ada's handwriting were becoming indistinguishable in their precision from Miriam's own, which was the correct outcome and the only outcome Miriam had been aiming for. The 2 barred rock survivors had integrated with the Wyandotte pullets without significant conflict, which was not guaranteed when mixing established hens with newcomers, but was more likely when the established birds were only 2 and the newcomers were 6. The co-op temperature was holding at 44 degrees overnight, which was adequate. Miriam had insulated the north wall with salvaged barn board and packed straw after the blizzard. The pullets would not lay until May, but they were growing at the expected rate, and their combs were developing on schedule. She made a note in the log in late March: 8 hens total, 2 laying. Production, 14 eggs, chasse week. All yolks to enriched loaves, whites to household or sold to Harold at cost. The operation had a rhythm. A rhythm is different from a routine, though from the outside they look similar. A routine is a sequence of actions. A rhythm is what happens when a sequence of actions has been repeated long enough that each action flows from the one before it, with the right amount of time between, neither too fast nor too slow, and the whole thing produces something that a single action, performed once, cannot produce. The bread Miriam was making in late March was not different in recipe from the bread she had been making in January. It was the same flour, the same water, the same culture, the same oven. But it was better in the way that the 40th repetition of a thing you understand is better than the first. And Miriam knew this without feeling anything particular about it, except a steady, quiet satisfaction that was close to, but not identical with, contentment. She was at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in the last week of March, the crock in front of her and nothing else. Not baking, not riding in the log. The evening bake was done and cooling on the rack, and Ada had gone home, and the coop was settled, and the house was warm from the oven's residual heat, and there was nothing that needed doing for at least an hour. She sat with the crock. She did not think about it in the way you think about an object. It was more that she kept it in her peripheral vision while her mind moved through other territory. She thought about the flower order she needed to place for April. She thought about whether the Wyandotte pullets were going to come into lay in May or drag into June, because there was always individual variation, and Reuben's estimate was an estimate. She thought about the log and whether she needed a new composition notebook yet, and she counted the remaining pages and decided she had another 3 weeks before she needed one. She thought about Eli, though not in the way of a wound, more the way you think of a tool you used for many years that is no longer in the drawer. Its shape is known. The place where it was is known. That is not the same as the absence being easy. But it is different from acute grief, which she had passed through in its time and come out the other side of, steadily, the way she came out the other side of most things. She thought about the Sunday in January when she had stood at this table with her hand on this crock, and it had been 45 degrees and she had been reaching for the cloth to throw it out. The distance between that moment and this moment was 8 weeks in calendar terms and 22 years in every other sense, because what had been in the crock those 8 weeks ago was 22 years of daily attention, and what was in the crock now was the same thing, still working, still doubling on its schedule, still smelling right. She thought about the phrase without saying it, the way you think of something someone told you long ago when you were sitting quietly and not reaching for anything in particular. You don't throw a loaf until you've knocked on it. And she had not. She had knocked, and the sound had come back, and she had put it in. She got up and lifted the cloth from the crock and put her nose over it, and the smell was right. The yeasty, living, sour smell of a culture in its correct state. And she pressed the back of her hand gently to the outside of the stoneware. Warm. The crock was warm from the organisms inside it working, 68 degrees against the back of her hand. Not room temperature, not 45, not the cold permanence of a thing that had decided to stop. She put the cloth back. She went to bed. Greg Prentice drove out on a Tuesday. She had not known he was coming, because he had no way to call ahead, except the phone shanty at the road, and he had tried the shanty on Monday and gotten no answer, which was common, and he had driven out anyway, on the theory that a working farm in late March was likely to have someone on the premises at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. He was right. Miriam was at the oven when she heard the car in the yard. He was 52 years old, a tall man going gray at the temples, wearing a canvas barn coat that was not new. She had seen Englisher buyers before, at the produce auction and at Harold's stand, and she could tell within a few seconds of the conversation whether they were buying something to have a story or whether they were buying something because they needed it. Prentice walked to the door and knocked, and when she opened it, he said his name and said Harold Schwartzentruber had told him about her bread and asked if he was catching her at a bad time. She considered the oven. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. "Come in." Ada was doing the Wednesday prep and looked at Prentice with the careful neutrality of someone who has been raised to be polite to Englishers, without assuming anything about them. Miriam did not introduce them. She finished monitoring the loaves, wrote the pull time in the log, and then came to the table and sat across from him. He explained his situation briefly. Mill Creek Natural Foods on the east side of Millersburg, 9 years in operation. Current clientele that leaned toward what he called the local and traditional market, meaning people who would pay more for something made by a specific person using a specific process in a specific place, and would come back for it if it was genuinely good. He had carried Amish and Mennonite products before. He knew the difference between a product that was good because it was associated with a particular way of life, and a product that was good because it was actually good. He was looking for the latter. She brought him a half loaf of the plain sourdough boule and a quarter loaf of the enriched sandwich bread, both from the previous day's bake, which meant they had set overnight and were at their best for tasting. She put them on the table without a plate because they did not need a plate. She sat back down. She did not watch him eat. He ate the way Harold ate things he was evaluating, without commentary during the process. He tore the bolé rather than cutting it, because it was easier to assess the crumb structure by tearing, and she noted that he knew this, which told her something. He ate most of the half loaf and the entire quarter loaf. He set the remainders down. "The sandwich loaf," he said. "What's in it?" "Egg yolk," she said. "1 per loaf, from my own hands." "Flour?" She told him the mill and the protein content and the hydration she was running. He wrote nothing down. He was listening in the way of someone whose memory is his notebook. "How long has the culture been running?" he asked. 22 years, she said. With an interruption in January. She told him about the blizzard briefly, the same way she had told Sadie Yoder, except without leaving anything out. The propane, the temperature, the tablespoon from the center of the crock, the 21 days back to full activity. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "So it's the same culture." "It's the same culture," she said. He looked at the remaining piece of boule on the table. He said, "Do you have a rate?" She told him what she charged Harold per loaf for each type. He nodded. He said he would need to price above that to cover his margin, and the question was whether his customers would pay it, and based on what he had just eaten, he believed they would. He said he would take 24 loaves a week to start, split evenly between the two types, with a review in 6 weeks to adjust the quantity, either direction based on sales. He said he could arrange pickup, or he could send someone, whichever was easier for her. She said pickup was fine, Tuesdays after 10. He put his hand in his coat pocket and took out a card case and took out a card, and then he looked at it and looked at her and said, "You don't have a phone." And she said there was a shanty at the road if he needed to reach her, and gave him the number. He wrote it on the back of his card and handed her the card with the store address on the front. Ada had not said a word during the entire conversation. When Prentice stood to leave and they shook hands at the door, Ada kept working at the counter with her back to the room. When the car had pulled out of the yard, Ada said without turning around, 24 loaves. "To start," Miriam said. Ada turned around then. She was not a girl who showed much in her face, which was a quality Miriam respected, and what showed now was not excitement exactly, but the thing underneath excitement, which is calculation. She was working out what 24 loaves a week meant for the Monday and Thursday schedule. Miriam let her work it out. "We'd need to add a Saturday," Ada said. "We would," Miriam said. Ada thought about it. "I can do Saturdays," she said. Miriam nodded and went to the log and wrote the date and the order and the terms in the column she'd been keeping for production notes, in the same plain penciled hand she'd been using in this notebook and the 3 before it. 24 loaves weekly. Mill Creek Natural Foods, Millersburg. First delivery next Tuesday. Now, here is what no one in District 14 knew on the Tuesday that Greg Prentice drove out to the farm. They knew, approximately, that Miriam was baking. Amos Hirschberger knew she was selling bread to Harold and to his daughter-in-law, Rebecca, and he thought of this as a modest and sensible thing for a woman in her situation to be doing, a way of getting by. Sadie Yoder knew there had been a project with the starter that had apparently come to something, because Rebecca had mentioned the bread was very good, and Sadie had relayed this at the most recent quilting frolic with the appropriate quiet approval that indicated a situation had resolved itself better than expected. The general understanding in the district was that Miriam Troyer, who had lost most of her hens and nearly lost her starter in the January blizzard, and who had spent 2 months building things back with that quiet, uncommunicative persistence of hers, was doing all right. All right was not 40 loaves a week. All right was not a standing order with a natural food store in Millersburg. All right was not a 19-year-old employee who had learned to shape a boule to a professional standard in 6 weeks, and who was, on her own initiative, calculating what a Saturday bake would require in terms of the feed schedule for Thursday and Friday. Amos found this out not from Miriam, but from the same man he had spoken to at the Charm produce auction in early March, the taller man from the district east of Charm, whose name was Eli Mast, which Amos knew though he had not used the name at the auction. Eli Mast ran a harness shop, and Amos stopped there on a Thursday in early April for a buckle repair, and Eli said while working on the harness that he had heard Miriam Troyer was supplying a store in Millersburg now. Amos said, "A store in Millersburg." Eli said he'd heard it from his wife, who had heard it from Harold Schwartzentruber's wife, which was a chain of transmission Amos recognized as generally reliable. He said, "How many loaves?" Eli looked up from the harness. He said, 40 a week, plus the standing order she just placed. So, more than 40. Amos was quiet for a moment. He set his hands on the counter and he looked at the buckle repair, and he said, "Well." He said it with the finality of a man arriving at a conclusion that feels like it was always his conclusion, which is a human quality and not a failing. He said, "She always did know what she was doing with bread." Eli Mast said that was true, and he finished the buckle repair, and Amos drove home. He stopped at Miriam's farm on the way, which was not much out of his way, and knocked at the kitchen door. Miriam opened it, and he could see Ada at the counter behind her, and he could smell the bread, which was substantial, the warm, yeasty, sour smell of a kitchen that has been baking all morning. He said, "I hear you're doing well." "Getting there," she said. He stood in the door for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily, or who saw clearly enough into his own conclusions to know when they had been wrong, and she did not require either of those things from him. She did not need his apology, and she did not need his revised estimation. The loaves on the rack behind her did not care what Amos Hirschberger thought of them. But she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I'll cut you a slice." He came in and sat at the table, and she cut him a slice of the plain boule and a slice of the enriched sandwich loaf and put them in front of him, and he ate both. He did not say anything analytical. He said it was good bread. She said thank you. He asked about the pullets, and she told him the Wyandottes were on track for late May, maybe early June, and that would get the egg production up enough to increase the enriched loaf ratio if the Millersburg order held. He nodded. He left without staying long, because he was not a man who stayed long when there was work happening around him that was not his work. At the door, he paused and said, "Glad it came right." She said, "Yes." And that was that. The week after Prentice placed his order, Miriam's total weekly production stabilized at 48 loaves, 24 for Mill Creek Natural Foods, 12 for Harold's produce stand, 6 for district customers including Rebecca Hirschberger, and 6 held as what she noted in the log as reserve, meaning loaves she would sell at the auction or to walk-in buyers if they appeared, and would otherwise consume or share within the district. The reserve category rarely lasted past Thursday. The 6-week review with Prentice came in mid-May. He drove out again on a Tuesday morning and sat at the same kitchen table and told her the sandwich loaves had sold completely every week, and the boolies had sold out in 4 of the 6 weeks. He wanted to increase the order to 30 loaves, split with slightly more sandwich loaves than bowls, 20 and 10. She said she could accommodate that in the current schedule. He asked about the egg situation. She said the Wyandottes had begun laying in the 2nd week of May, 3 of the 6 so far, and the other 3 should follow within 2 weeks. He said good. She did not tell him that she had known, with reasonable confidence, that the production was scalable. She had been running the numbers in the log since February. She did not tell him that the 6 reserve loaves per week had been, in part, a buffer she kept so that she could absorb an increase without scrambling when it came. She didn't tell him any of this because he had not asked, and because the log, which she had been keeping every 12 hours since the day after the blizzard, contained all of it in plain pencil in a composition notebook in the kitchen drawer, available to anyone who wanted to check. The Wyandotte pullets came fully into lay by the 1st of June, 8 hens total, producing a combined average of 6 eggs per day, which was normal for a mixed flock of this age and composition. 14 yolks a week went into the enriched loaves. The 2 Barred Rock survivors were laying at the same rate they had been since February, steady and unspectacular, 1 egg each per day. Miriam had not named them. She noted their production in the log the same way she noted everything else: date, count, any variation from the baseline. The loaves went out on Tuesdays and Fridays in cloth-lined crates that Prentice's driver collected from the farm. Each loaf was wrapped in unbleached parchment and tied with a simple knot. No label, no decoration. Prentice had asked if she wanted to put a name on them. She had said she would think about it. She had not yet concluded. One Tuesday in late June, Prentice lifted one of the sandwich loaves from the delivery crate in the back of his store. He did this while his employee was unloading the rest of the order, running a Tuesday morning count before the store opened. He lifted the loaf, and it was still warm from the morning bake, which meant it had left the farm within the last 2 hours, and the warmth of it came through the parchment into his hand, the way warmth comes through cloth, present and continuous, the warmth of something still in process, still going. He set it on the prep counter. He stood for a moment with his hand resting on it, not pressing, not testing, just the habit of a man who handles food for a living and registers its state without deciding to. The loaf was warm. The crust was set. Beneath his hand he could feel the faint give of the crumb, the structure of it, the air held inside it by 22 years of the same culture, fed through every ordinary day and one extraordinary January. And whatever was in it that was still working could not be felt through the parchment, but was, in the most exact and literal sense, still there. He took his hand off the loaf and went to open the store. There is a thing that happens in certain long, procedural kinds of effort, where the outcome, when it arrives, does not feel like an ending. It feels like a stabilization. A culture does not stop being alive when it starts being reliable. A bakery does not finish being built when it starts producing consistently. What happened in that farmhouse kitchen in Holmes County, Ohio, over the 20-odd weeks from a January blizzard to a June morning when 8 hens were laying and 30 loaves a week were leaving for Millersburg, was not a comeback. Comebacks are for things that were finished. This was something that was never finished, that some people concluded was finished before they had checked, and that turned out, on checking, to be doing exactly what it had been doing for 22 years, working in the cold or the warmth at whatever rate conditions allowed, making the thing it was made to make. Miriam Troyer did not throw the loaf. She knocked on it first, and the sound that came back was the right sound, and she knew what that meant, and she put it in. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found.